And so now we're going to go through this section, which is from page 27 through to 41. So if you have your books out, that's what we'll be looking at now. And it begins with Daniel Rook having commented that he's taken an oath to swear and serve and obey, and particularly the obedience part is significant here, but that is just words. The reality of that hasn't hit him yet. And then he learns where the words to serve and obey might lead. There's an example of officers from the Renegade who failed to serve and obey. They didn't actually mutiny, so they didn't actually kind of overthrow the captain, but they talked about it. And Rook watches as the leader of the mutineers, who was a lieutenant, just like himself, was hanged. And there's a really graphic description of the hanging with his a bag pulled over his head, and then he shat himself. He's jerking at the end of the rope. So very graphic imagery there, to really emphasize the brutality, I guess, of the punishment for mutiny or disobedience. So the description continues, and he sees the hand opening and closing of the man as he's dying. He sees the man as nothing more than a bag of meat. And then there's two other men who didn't lead the mutineers but followed them. These men were not hanged, but they had the commander their sword, and he cut off their badges of rank, and their buttons, and the jackets were kind of destroyed, which could be symbolic to them being outcast and them being destroyed as well. And so their heads were shaven, these two men, and there's a description that they were not dead, but they might as well be. They would never again have a place in the world with somebody who had been ejected in such dishonour, which I can imagine that Rook would see as a terrible punishment, because he so desperately yearned for a sense of belonging as well. Okay, page 29. So every member had to stand at attention to watch this, and it really emphasised the consequence of disobedience. I starred this as a really defining moment for Rook. He knew he wouldn't forget this moment. He'd been assaulted into numbness, and he recognised that under the benign surface of life in His Majesty's service, under its rituals and its uniforms and its pleasantries, was horror. So benign means harmless. So on the surface it looks harmless, but underneath the rituals, underneath the uniforms and all of the rules, regulations and pleasantries was horror. So he recognises, I guess, that sense that where he had a place to belong, now he's found that there's actually something horrible at the centre of it. And he recognises this here. He'd thought he could find a niche, a place where he could belong, a niche. But now he realises that for that sense of belonging, a payment would be extracted. And in order to serve and obey, you had to take away your humanity, or the suspension of human response. If you were to become part of the mighty imperial machine, you had to push down your humanity or suspend your human response, or you would become inhuman in another way, a bag of meat or a walking dead man, referring to those three gentlemen, the one who was hanged and the two who were outcast. And the realization comes that he thought he'd found all he needed, a sense of belonging, identity. But now as he dreamed of that man's hand opening and closing, he realizes he hadn't actually. And then in 1781, in Chesapeake Bay, in the Revolutionary War in the United States, Rooke takes part in war, and there is now on the next few pages a really graphic description that war is messy and painful. So there's a sea battle, and there's a combination of logic that Rooke uses in some of the descriptions. So combat is a question of distance, trajectory, speed relative to direction. So there's the theory of war, and then the reality, which turns into something far more chaotic. So Rooke started to think of prime numbers, but Silk was checking his musket. The top of page 31, we start to see the chaos. Now, this is the juxtaposition of the theory, which was of war, which is tidy, and what actually happened bore no resemblance to that. I noticed the repetition of the gerund form of the verb here: firing, reloading, ramming, the priming, the firing again. So we've got 5 verbs repeated, the gerund forms, which really gives a sense of the chaos and the immediacy of the urgency of war. And that's repeated later on this page. The motions of loading, ramming, priming here. Because they're being fired at as well as firing. There's people screaming. There's splintering of their ship falling apart. And at one moment, Rooke thinks he's dying. This is death, he thought, but he actually doesn't die. And then he sees the image of Private Truby, who does die. And this is really a graphic description of this man's death. And both he and Silk witness this. So Private Truby is trying to rise. He's heaving upwards. So he's like trying to let his hands actually lift him up. And he's looking down to see why his arms can't lift his body up. He's pushing and pushing, but there's actually no body left. There's a shambles of his own flesh and his entrails, like his innards, his stomach and everything that is pouring out and gluing him to the deck. So this is a graphic description of his death, and both Silk and Rooke watch this, and they share this moment, and it certainly impacts them. This little star shows a passing of time. Again, Rooke, here, his consciousness is extinguished. Basically, he's knocked unconscious. Later, he wakes up in the hospital at Portsmouth, so we don't really even know what happens. You can imagine that, like you're in war. One moment you're there, and the next moment, 3 weeks later, you're waking up in a hospital. So there's a real sense of that. And he says death would be better than the pain in his head. So he's had a physical pain to remind him or symbolize the traumatic moment that he experienced. And then he connects that to the memory of the deck of the Resolution. So that pain is linked to the memory. And during his convalescence, as he is recovering, his sister sits by his bed. So we see again that bond between the siblings. And we watch him recover but still be impacted. And that's at the bottom of page 33. We see this as he goes for a walk, back where that place on the beach where he'd stored his pebbles, and he looked for his collection of pebbles. And it's been 10 years since then, so he must be around 23 at this stage. Is that about right? Anyway, 21 perhaps, I don't know. Anyway, he looks for his pebbles. And then when he finds it empty, he actually starts to cry, even though he knew that they couldn't be here. But he feels like he has lost everything. So these pebbles symbolize perhaps his innocence, his past self, and there's a sense of sorrow at the innocence that he's lost. And the description, the impact of the war, the trauma, the horrors of the reality of service have really stolen his peace. Where he had a peace, where he thought to find a future, and he even found that, now there's nothing, just the pain in his head and his heart, and had seen into the reality of the evil of life. He could smell the evil. And 35, let's go to. There's another star, so it's 2 years later. I think at this point, 2 years after the battle he was in, the war ended, and we all know because of history that England actually lost the war. And that was a huge humiliation for His Majesty's soldiers. And during that time, both Silk and Rook, as they're recovering, they're on half pay. There's the half life, half pay. They're kind of not alive, but not dead either. And there's a bitterness in that life. A man on half pay did not starve, but he did not properly live either. He also describes the alteration in Silk, his friend. They can still kind of amuse, make a joke, but something has been blighted. Something has been really stained in both of them. And so to War and a Sickly Season, they actually made that chant as innocent young soldiers, and now they understood that toast too well, because war actually created sickness in both of them. And he thinks back on him who used to be as foolish, dangerous, and disastrously innocent. And the unity that comes through both of them watching Truby's death, they forged a bond there through sharing that moment. Rook bides his time with half pay. He's supplemented by tutoring. So he tutors maths, astronomy, Latin, Greek. So maths, astronomy, language. And interesting, Anne says, "Oh, Dan, what was the point of being hit on the head if it did not give you the blessing as being stupid as the rest of us? How intelligence can perhaps be a curse." And he would wake up and he's in the bed that has been meant for a child. So he was actually meant to be launched into life as adulthood, and he's still trapped in his childhood bed. And now he's 23, and he doesn't know what he's going to do with the rest of his life. And there's a start of a new section. Daniel Rook was a young boy collecting pebbles, this metaphor of innocence and dreams, when Cook first landed in New South Wales. That's in 1770. But in 1778, when Rook was 24, Dr. Vickery, who's the astronomer, said that they could have a need of an astronomer in the 1788 trip from England to Australia. This was the trip which was going to take a bunch of convicts, the overflow from the prisons. And so Dr. Vickery, so he's actually saying they need an astronomer to witness a comet, which is supposed to only come around in 1532, 1661, 1788. And it would only be visible from the southern hemisphere, which is why Rooke has to go. And the major, who's the one in charge of his regiment, doesn't want to argue with Dr. Vickery, the Astronomer Royal, so he's been offered a chance to go along the first fleet. And 10 years ago, Rooke would have seen this as like something that, because he's so intelligent, he should be, it was his due to be offered this chance, the way things ought to be. And there's a metaphor that's used here, the smooth machinery of the world moving in harmony with another. But now he does not trust that machine. There's a loss of innocence that's reinforced there. And so he decides to go to New South Wales. His desire for exploration and adventure. Silk actually also is suggesting he goes. Silk has now become Captain Lieutenant Silk, and we notice that it's not only Captain Silk, the rank, that is his ambition, but there's a sense that he wants to be a writer. Rooke realises that Silk has also been waiting for his true vocation to become possible, which is writing. He is a storyteller, and we start to understand the character of Silk a little bit more. So he tells stories to these fellow soldiers in the mess. It's not simply to entertain, but the elegance of phrases, the words, the flexing of its shape was the point. So he's a writer at heart, and in the same way that maths and numbers is in Rooke. And we have a final scene, which is Anne saying farewell, and Anne has this globe still. They talk about the being on the other side of the world, seeing the moon, and Anne says as she looks at the moon every night, she will think of her brother. And finally, Rooke takes out his red jacket and he looks at it and he starts to feel sick. I think there's a sense that perhaps he might have something like PTSD, but again, that wouldn't be known at the time. But he can smell the sweat of his terror and the gunpowder. So he put it on anyway, but it brings him back. He'd come close to dying, but he'd been spared, and now he has a new beginning that's been offered. And that leads us to the next section, part 2, which is the astronomer, which we'll go on with tomorrow.